Hi, everyone. If you are in first or second hour, today is Thursday, the 10th. If you are in fourth or fifth hour, today is Friday, the 11th. So today you're going to play this video and take notes on your own, and then you can use what you remember from this video and your notes to complete the exit ticket by today. Again, that's Thursday if you're in first or second hour, or Friday if you are in fourth or fifth hour. And if you can do that by 3:15, which is the end of your asynchronous day. All right, so here we go. All right. So for the last week or so, we've been talking about a couple of things. So putting these things together. So we talked first about the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. And remember, the government wanted to do this to fulfill our dream of manifest destiny. So settling the United States from coast to coast. And we really wanted to give people a quick and safe way to get from the east, where the majority of the population was, out west, right to the Great Plains to settle, or even to California. The Transcontinental Railroad is completed in 1869, and by 1900 there are 5 of them, right? So where the government is really trying to make sure that people can get out west to settle, also to be able to bring back some of those things that are in the west, whether it is agricultural goods or gold, back to the population centers in the east. To fulfill this idea of manifest destiny, like really settling the Great Plains, the government wanted to motivate people to actually go out there and build a house and set up a homestead. Doesn't seem like that big of a deal. You'd be like, oh yeah, I would totally go. But we got to remember there is nothing out there, right? It is uncolonized, it's barren, it's just, there's no target or mire or even a person, right? For miles and miles. The French and the Spanish had, previously controlled lots of that land that was currently the Great Plains in 1862, but they hadn't successfully gotten people to colonize it. And the government says, well, we really can't fulfill our dream of manifest destiny unless we have people out there and we fill it up and we colonize it and it's a bunch of farms. So the government motivates people not only with this reliable transportation system, the Transcontinental Railroad, but also they say, we'll give you some free stuff, right? We'll give you land. And for immigrants that have come to the United States in the recent past, or even immigrants maybe in 1862 that are still in Europe, that's crazy. That is like winning the lottery. Nobody gives away free land, because land is power. It is wealth. It is absolute freedom to do what you want. So the government has an actual, piece of legislation, this act, and it says for every homesteader that is able to successfully complete this land race, which we saw this clip of, right, on Wednesday, you'll get 160 acres. And you only have to pay $10, which, that's a decent chunk of change in 1862, but it's not unattainable to the average everyday citizen. So $10, you get 160 acres, but you do have to live on it, cultivate it, put up a farm, stay there for 5 years. Now, this is really to prevent somebody from just going out there, taking part in a land race, getting the deed for their 160 acres, and then going back to their nice cushy house out east and not actually settling it. They want you to settle this, right? To set up a farm. And it might take you 5 years to do it. It might take you 5 years to actually be able to plant, put in crops, harvest them, because this has never been done before in this particular area of the country, right? You are plowing up virgin fields that have never actually had, corn or wheat or whatever in them before. So this is tough. But between 1862 and 1900, you have about 600,000 people that move west. Many of these people are from other countries. As I said, as a review, remember on Wednesday, we looked at a clip. We talked about in our fictional movie, these were 2 Irish immigrants, right, that had gotten basically an advertisement, and they came out to Oklahoma, in our case, to participate in a land race and to take advantage of the Homestead Act. All right. So here we are now. Well, okay, this is great. But what we need to realize is it's not empty out in the Great Plains. There are people there, right? And the government has pushed these people, right, kind of since contact, west, further and further west. And when they built the Transcontinental Railroad, obviously they came in conflict, well, with some of these folks that were living out there. And if you're going to actually encourage white settlement out there, they're going to come into contact with these people, and probably conflict is going to arise. So that's kind of the subject of our discussion today. One thing before we continue, just a word on how we refer to people who are, Native American or American Indian or indigenous people. You can hear different phrases, and I'm going to really try to change my phraseology to American Indians. So whenever possible, Native peoples would prefer to be called by their specific tribal name. So there's over 500 different Indian tribes registered with the federal government. They all consider themselves different. They're not the same, right? They're not the same people. So if you are a Ute, right, you live in Utah and you're a Ute, well, that makes you different from a Saginaw Valley Chippewa Indian, someone who lives basically near Mount Pleasant, right? That's where their tribal land is. They're not the same. So there have been some umbrella terms that have been used in recent history, designed to be very, respectful and inclusive. So Native American was always the one that, I was kind of taught during my collegiate career or high school career. Now that has kind of fallen out of favor with some groups. They don't really like that. And American Indian has become maybe the more preferred name, or even some folks who, we would say are American Indian, they prefer Indigenous American. So you might hear those different phrases, and I'm just going to I'll probably correct myself several times. So I'm really trying to use the American Indian phrase. All right. So we're going to come into conflict, right? This is Clashes on the Prairie. This is the topic of our presentation. All right. Your book does spend a little time in Module 2, Section 1, talking about how important the horse and the buffalo were to the traditional Native American way of life when we, catch up with Native Americans in the 1800s. The horse is not an indigenous animal to North America. It's brought here by the Spanish, and it becomes readily adopted by American Indian or even indigenous peoples throughout the continent, because it makes hunting more efficient. It certainly makes them more mobile, right? They're going to be able to travel more ground riding a horse than they would be maybe doing, just walking. So the horse is very important to traditional way of life for American Indians in the 1800s. In addition, when you talk specifically about Plains Indians, or the Indians out in the Great Plains, this area that in the 1860s the government is trying to settle, they are also going to rely primarily on the buffalo. So the buffalo, if you've ever seen a buffalo up close, they are huge, ginormous animals. And Native Americans not only hunted them for their meat, but they really used them for everything: food, clothing, shelter. There was nothing from that animal, once it was hunted and killed, that went to waste, right? There was no waste rotting in, the woods or on the plains. They used it for everything. And this really allows them to be absolutely self-sufficient and to continue their traditional way of life. Even as, obviously, east of the Mississippi, European settlers have been coming for a couple of hundred years, and they're kind of changing things in the United States. The Plains Indians are able to live as they have lived for hundreds of years because they rely on these two specific animals to do so. And they don't need the US government to really give them anything, right? They can provide for it on their own. All right. So as we have talked about in the last couple days, the US government wants to build a railroad, and the US government wants settlement out in the Great Plains. Well, the US government realizes and experiences conflicts then with Native Americans. And they really want Native Americans to, or American Indians, I gotta correct myself, to stop living their traditional way of life. And they want them to be more like us. They want them to settle down. They want them to be farmers. They want them to maybe get a job in a dry goods store. They want them to be more like the white settlers. In order to do that, the government is going to have to stop Native Americans from being able to engage in their traditional way of life, because that's what the Native Americans want to do. They see no reason to change. So the government determines, hey, you know what? If they have the buffalo, they have all of the means of engaging in their traditional way of life. So if we take the buffalo away from them, they will have to start buying things for their food, clothing, and shelter. They're not going to be able to make it anymore. They're not going to be able to use the buffalo to, invent it. So the government actively seeks to exterminate the buffalo. And if they can get rid of the buffalo, Native Americans will have to change their lifestyle because they won't be able to engage in their traditional ways. So without the buffalo, Native Americans will have to change, and they will be missing their own self-sufficient way to get food, clothing, and shelter. What does the government want them to do? All right, so I just said it. The government wants them to be like us. They want them to be farmers. This is an important vocabulary word or concept, right? So the word is the US government wants them to assimilate. So assimilation means that you have a dominant culture within a country or a state, and they are going to impose their culture, their tradition, their norms on a less powerful group within this country or state. And that's really what has happened, right? Native Americans are not as powerful as they once were. They're not really the dominant culture in the United States any longer. So the United States government wants them to assimilate, be like us, be farmers, wear the clothes that we wear, buy your clothing at the dry goods store, wear things that we wear, educate your children like we educate our children. So be like us, assimilate. Now, it would be one thing if Native Americans said, oh, yeah, that sounds good. Yep, you're right. We were kind of tired of our traditional way of life. It wasn't working out. We would love to be just like you. Okay, if that would have happened, then we wouldn't have had any of this. Obviously, as you can imagine, that's not what they said, right? They saw no reason to change. They like the way they live. They feel like their way of life is much better than what these, white European settlers are doing. And sometimes what these white European settlers are doing really goes against everything that they feel is right and moral and, true about the universe around them. So you can imagine that it does not go peacefully, right? And they're not just going to say, okay, and they're going to resist as much as they possibly can resist. And as things get more and more dire for their situation, they will resist more and more, okay? Which is where we get a lot of these conflicts. Your book mentions several, different battles or skirmishes or, instances where both Native Americans and predominantly the U.S. cavalry might be killed or get into battle with each other. It's not important to me that you know any of the names of any of those battles or skirmishes, just that obviously we have some, significant resistance, right, from American Indians saying, we don't want to do this. We want to live how we have always lived. Okay. All right. So how does the government, though, respond to American Indian resistance? So getting rid of the buffalo is kind of their first attempt to try to force Native Americans to assimilate. They also do a couple of other things. So one is a piece of legislation that they pass in 1887, and it's a piece of legislation called the Dawes Act. And I have actually attached a PDF copy. It's a very short one of the Dawes Act, and you can read it, but it is an act, right? So it's a piece of government legislation, and it reads like a piece of government legislation. It's pretty short, though, the excerpt that I have for you. So I'm just going to explain it, though. So what does it say? All right, so this is an act that kind of changes how the United States government is going to treat Native Americans or Native American tribes as a group. So they basically said, the government said, under this act, the tribal or community leaders could no longer speak for the group of Native Americans. So they didn't recognize a tribe anymore. It was just individual Native Americans. And they were going to treat them like individuals, not groups. So since they said, okay, there is no tribe anymore, so if there are tribal lands, we're not going to recognize these as tribal lands. We're going to divide it up between the individual members of the tribe. And they have some different amounts of land that they're going to give to different American Indians depending on their status. So to each head of family, right? So if you have this head of family here, they get a quarter of a section, which is 160 acres. Okay, so this family would get 160 acres. To each single person under the age of 18, they would get an eighth of a section, right? So here's our person under the age of 18 here. He's going to get an eighth of a section, right? Which is going to be half, right? So 80 acres. Then to each orphan child under the age of 18, they would get an eighth of a section, right? So here's our orphan. He's very sad. He's also going to get an eighth of a section up here. And then we have to each other single person under 18 years now living, or who may be born prior to the date of the order of the president directing the allotment of lands embraced in any reservation, basically meaning until this thing is signed into law, you would get a 16th, right? So this piece of legislation is kind of waiting on the president's desk. This little baby here is born. He'll get a 16th, okay? And then it's signed into law, and then everything's kind of like, okay, here it is. Now, if you'll kind of notice, there's land left, right? Like there's some land left here. That's going to be interesting. So think this first question, what is the government trying to encourage American Indians to do or to be, right? They're saying, hey, family, here you go, got 160 acres. Here, young man, you have 80 acres. What do they want them to do? Well, be a farmer, right? Like you're going to take this land and you're going to farm. You're going to build a house, plant some corn maybe. For your minor children that might be orphans, okay, you're going to have this, right? And then when you're ready, you're going to have it. And this is how you're going to make a living. You're going to be a farmer, right? Just like us. It's awesome. Now, there's a couple of things wrong with this though, right? So first of all, the United States is going to hold on to these sections, these quarters or eighth of an acres for 25 years. So even if this young guy says, you know what, I don't want to be a farmer, I will just sell this, take my money, and I'll put it in, my pocket, and maybe I'll try my luck at going out and living a more traditional way of life, in what will become, Washington State or something. The government says, no, you can't sell it for 25 years. So you're kind of locked in, right? You're either going to be a farmer or you're going to walk away and leave it, right? Now there is an incentive. If you do this, okay, so for this young man here, if he does it and he says, okay, oh my gosh, I'm going to be a farmer, the government says, you can be a citizen. We will make you a citizen right now in 1887. Now the interesting thing is, American Indians in 1887 are not citizens of this country, right? In fact, Native Americans do not become citizens of the United States until 1924. So if this young man decided, I'm not going to be a farmer, or this is not going to work for me, he loses this land. The government will take it. So now he has no land, no reservation, no tribe, and he's still not a citizen of the United States. Okay. So it is it's a carrot that the government extends, really, again, trying to get American Indians to be like us, to assimilate. All right. So what benefits does the government get? If it works, Native Americans will assimilate. Also, as we pointed out a minute ago, not all of this land here, not all of these plots are going to go to these Native Americans, because the way that they had calculated the acreage to go to each individual person or family, there may be land left over. So who gets that land? Think for a moment. The government gets that land, right? So the government takes it and they will sell it to white settlers. Okay. So this is a win-win, right? From the government's perspective. Another thing that is done is Indian boarding schools are created. Now, these are not run by the federal government, but in many cases they are funded by the federal government, and they are located throughout the United States. I want you to pause my presentation and to watch this video. So here is the link. It is also in the this assignment section in Google Classroom as well. But if you click this link, it's a story about a Native American named Zikalisha, and it's called A Walk in Two Worlds. She's actually introduced in Module 2, Section 1, and she's a Native American who goes to one of these Indian boarding schools. And this is about a 9-minute video. And as you watch, I want you to take note of a couple things. What do they do to these students that makes it more difficult for them to learn their traditional Native American culture or American Indian culture, right? There are some things that they do to them. And she describes it because it's her own kind of personal experience. And in some cases, she's not filling everything in for you. You just kind of have to imagine you might get it from how she describes, oh, this is what they're supposed to be doing, or, oh, this is what was happening, okay? I will tell you that there's a lot of scholarship and documentation about Indian boarding schools, and this is a little more of a sanitized clip. Obviously, you guys are young high school kids. There was a lot of very bad things that went on in these Indian boarding schools, besides just interrupting the transmission of Native American or American Indian culture from grandparents, parents to children. So if you are to ever do some further research, I don't want you to feel like I was lying to you by not telling you some things, but there are some really bad things that go on in these particular places. But I want you to focus on what things are done to students that make it very difficult for them to learn their traditional culture. All right, so consider 3 things: the killing of the buffalo, the Dawes Act, and Indian boarding schools. Again, what is the government trying to get American Indians to do? And the important word or vocabulary concept, flash, we've been talking about it a lot, assimilation. They want them to assimilate, to be like us. And they're trying a bunch of different methods to do it. All right. So please pause here, watch your video, and then come back. Okay. So hopefully you're back. And we will talk together on Monday, right? Monday or Tuesday, yeah, about what you learned from the video and some of the things that we're discussing here. And now we're kind of getting to the end. And I don't mean that this is the end of Native Americans or American Indians not being upset about what's happening to them, not trying to resist in some manner, certainly not an end to their, kind of suffering, but it's an end really to their ability to resist. So their resistance has been going on for a long time, right? Whether it is, actively fighting against the U.S. military or ignoring, some treaties and continuing with their traditional way of life. But we're going to get to an event called the Battle of Wounded Knee, which occurs on December 28th in 1890. And this is sort of where historians mark the end of an organized resistance of Native Americans in the plains and maybe throughout the country, actively trying to resist the U.S. government in their quest to get the Native Americans, American Indians, to assimilate. So I have 2 things for you to look at. So one is a primary source reading from an American Indian named Dick Foolbear. And he's a kid. He was not actually present, but he is nearby in the area. And he writes about, it's a first person account of what he observes and sees in relation to what happened. The beginning of that first person account also has an introduction, and it does talk about this issue of the ghost dances and what the official report of the government was in relation to what happened at Wounded Knee. So at this point, just to kind of set the stage before you read it, Native Americans are really, they just don't have the materials, the resources to resist the U.S. government anymore. The buffalo are gone. They're not able to continue with their traditional way of life. So they're relying on the US government for food, clothing, and shelter. They're really trying to, be traditional, but they can't. And many medicine men or, religious persons in the American Indian community had this revelation. And they said that they had determined that a traditional ghost dance would basically turn back the hands of time and bring back their perfect world. And the white man would leave and go away, and everything would be good again. And Dick Foolbear is going to explain this to you. And apparently this ghost dance had a big pivotal part to play in what happened at Wounded Knee. So please read Dick Foolbear. It's only a couple of pages. And then I have a clip. It's about 4 to 5 minutes. And it is from a Hollywood movie called Hidalgo. It doesn't really have anything to do with Native Americans per se, but the beginning has a character played by Viggo Mortensen, and he is of American Indian descent. And he is present when the Battle of Wounded Knee takes place. Now, clearly, the actual event would take a little more than 5 minutes, but it's in color, it's pretty short and sweet, and it gives you an indication of what historians really think happened. And so Dick Foolbear and this really quick clip should give you more of an indication of what happened at the Battle of Wounded Knee. And I'm using my little air quotes here because it's not really much of a battle, but it really does kind of punctuate for Native Americans. We can't resist anymore, right? And they're kind of done. So please watch those. And then immediately after, although I have it split up into 2 separate clips, there is a clip from the same movie, and it is reenacting something for you called Buffalo Bill's Wild West Show. So Buffalo Bill was actually kind of a cowboy, buffalo hunter who went out west and killed buffalo. And then he comes back later out east, and he puts together a variety show, kind of like a circus. That's what we would think of it. Now, what we have to realize in the 1890s, even into the early 1900s, 1910s, there's no television, there's no movies, there's no radio, but people still want to be entertained. So there would often be these like traveling circuses or traveling, sideshows or, people that would put on like plays or singing and dancing acts, right? And they might set up in a big tent on the outskirts of town, or maybe there was a theater in your town and they would come and entertain you. So Buffalo Bill would put on, as you can see, obviously from his poster right here, the best show on earth, right? This is a guy who kind of markets his show as, I'm going to show you guys from out east who've never been out west before what the West is really like. And he would reenact things. One of the things that he would reenact is the Battle of Wounded Knee. And in the clip that I'm going to show you, it's about 2 minutes long, they have a reenactment of the Battle of Wounded Knee. But what I want you to think about is, after you watch both clips, what's the biggest difference between probably what's more historically accurate, what really occurred, and what Buffalo Bill is showing the American people? And if you are one of these Americans in 1895, maybe, that goes to Buffalo Bill's Wild West Show, and he's portraying live and in person what the Battle of Wounded Knee was like, you're probably going to believe it. You're going to believe what you're seeing in this show. Because again, there's no CNN. You don't actually have photographs in the newspaper. Buffalo Bill is going to become kind of your history teacher. And what is going to happen is shows like Buffalo Bill, they're going to kind of create this stereotype of an American Indian, a stereotype that's really going to last for a very, very long time. So I want you to also think about that. How does this show create this stereotype? All right. So please watch those 2 videos. In your notes, think about those 2 things. And when you are ready, you can take your exit ticket. Take the exit ticket, which is on a Google quiz form, and submit that. And then on Monday, if you are in first or second hour, or Tuesday, if you're in fourth or fifth hour, we will ask and talk about some of these things, right? In relation to Native Americans and their experience as Western settlers encroached on their tribal lands in the prairie. All right, I'll see you guys later.